There are places whose silence feels practiced, as though it has been rehearsed for generations, layered and refined until it no longer belongs to the absence of sound, but to something deliberate and watchful. The hill above the James River, where the orphanage once stood, is such a place. Even now, the wind behaves strangely there, passing over the ground without the restless whistling common to open fields, moving instead in slow, dragging breaths that seem to hesitate before touching anything. Long before the building was raised, travelers recorded unease upon passing that slope, noting the way their horses refused water from nearby streams, and how the air grew cool regardless of season, as if the land itself remembered winter more clearly than summer. By the time the orphanage was founded in 1740, the hill had already acquired a reputation for sorrow that could not be traced to any single event, only to a vague and persistent intuition shared by those who lingered too long. The first official mention of the Virginia Repentance Orphanage appears in colonial correspondence, written with the clipped efficiency of men who believed order could be imposed through ink alone. It was described as a necessary institution, a moral solution to an increasing number of abandoned children left in the wake of illness, famine, and quiet domestic ruin. The language was careful, even virtuous, filled with assurances of discipline, prayer, and industry, yet beneath it lay a tone of urgency that betrayed unease. These children, the letters warned, must be contained, corrected, and shaped before their unchecked grief hardened into moral rot. No mention was made of tenderness, no mention was made of comfort. What was emphasized instead was repentance, as though childhood itself were a transgression requiring atonement. The building rose quickly, constructed of dark timber, hauled from forests that local men avoided after dusk. Its walls were thick, its windows narrow, their glass warped and imperfect, bending the daylight into dull, uneven planes that never fully illuminated the interior rooms. From a distance, the structure appeared stooped, its roofline sagging subtly at the center, as if the weight of unseen years had already begun to press downward. The bell tower, modest and unadorned, stood apart from the main building, connected by a covered walkway that amplified every footstep into a hollow, lingering echo. Those echoes, it was later said, had a way of returning long after the walker had passed, repeating themselves faintly, as though the building were unwilling to let motion end. The children arrived in small groups at first, brought by wagons whose drivers rarely lingered. Some were orphans in the strictest sense, survivors of fever outbreaks that moved through the colonies with indifferent cruelty. Others were quieter cases, children whose parents still lived, but could no longer tolerate the reminder of loss, shame, or inconvenience. Records list ages and surnames with admirable precision, but they say nothing of faces, nothing of voices, nothing of the small private habits by which a child attempts to anchor themselves to a world that has already proven unreliable. What survives instead are inventories: the number of beds, the number of spoons, the number of psalms recited each morning before the first labor bell. From the beginning, the orphanage functioned less as a refuge and more as a mechanism. Days were divided into rigid segments marked by bells whose tones differed subtly enough that the children learned to distinguish them even in sleep. Meals were sparse and uniform, heavy on grain and water, designed less for nourishment than for restraint. Speech was discouraged outside of prayer and instruction, and laughter, when it occurred, was met with swift correction. The caretakers, referred to in records only by surname and title, were chosen not for warmth, but for moral fortitude, a quality defined at the time as the ability to endure discomfort without complaint and to impose the same endurance upon others. Local villagers spoke little of the orphanage, though its presence pressed upon their routines like a shadow that shifted with the sun. On Sundays, the sound of hymns drifted down the hill, but they were sung slowly, without harmony, each child's voice isolated within the collective, creating a thin, wavering chorus that unsettled listeners who could not articulate why. At night, faint lights could be seen moving behind the narrow windows, long after the official hour of rest, their motion uneven, pausing often, as if guided by hands unsure of their purpose. Those who asked questions were met with polite deflection, reminders that the work being done there was difficult but necessary, and that discomfort was an expected companion to righteousness. The first rumors did not involve cruelty or death, but something more difficult to name. Farmers passing near the hill at dawn reported hearing a low, sustained sound that resembled neither prayer nor song, but lingered somewhere between the two, rising and falling without clear rhythm. It was described as a lament, though no single voice could be identified within it, and it never carried words that could be understood. The sound dissipated with the sunrise, leaving behind an oppressive quiet that clung to the fields well into the morning. Attempts to trace its source were unsuccessful, and the caretakers denied any knowledge of unusual activities during the night. As months turned into years, the orphanage became a fixed feature of the landscape, its presence accepted with the resigned familiarity reserved for things that cannot easily be changed. Children continued to arrive, their names added to ledgers, their belongings reduced to numbers and stored away. Some were noted as having been transferred to apprenticeships or distant relatives, though no records confirmed their arrival at those destinations. Others simply ceased to appear in daily tallies, their absence marked with a brief notation and no accompanying explanation. The numbers, however, never seemed to decrease. New names always appeared to replace the old, maintaining a steady population that gave the illusion of continuity. Those who lived nearest to the hill began to avoid looking toward the orphanage at certain hours, particularly at dusk, when the light angled just enough to catch the warped glass and scatter reflections across the surrounding trees. In those moments, the windows appeared crowded, filled with indistinct shapes that shifted as the sun moved, resolving into nothing once darkness fell. The air at that hour grew noticeably colder, carrying with it a faint, persistent odor that residents struggled to describe, something like damp wood mixed with old cloth and extinguished candles. It was not the smell of decay, but of prolonged use, of materials worn thin by repetition. By the end of its first decade, the Virginia Repentance Orphanage had established itself not as a place of hope, but as a presence that resisted scrutiny. Its records were immaculate, its correspondence measured and formal, its public face one of quiet piety. Yet beneath that surface lay a growing sense that something within its walls was being carefully preserved, something that required isolation, silence, and the steady accumulation of unspoken grief. The hill did not forget, and neither, it seemed, did the building that had been raised upon it. Even before the first undeniable tragedy occurred, there was already the sense that the orphanage was listening, waiting, and learning the rhythms of human suffering with a patience far exceeding that of its caretakers. By the winter of 1744, the orphanage had learned how to keep its own counsel. Snow fell heavier on the hill than on the surrounding lowlands, not in greater quantity, but in the way it lingered, compacting into gray, stubborn layers that resisted the weak colonial sun. Footprints leading toward the building often appeared shallower than those leading away, as though the ground itself were reluctant to record arrivals. Inside, the air was perpetually cool, carrying the stale breath of extinguished hearths and damp wool. Even when fires burned, Their warmth seemed to stop short of the walls, pooling instead at the center of rooms before receding again, leaving fingers numb and joints aching long before the night bell rang. The children learned quickly that sound behaved differently within those walls. A cough might echo down corridors far longer than expected, while a cry, once raised, could vanish abruptly, swallowed as if by thick fabric. Whispers traveled unpredictably, sometimes carrying with unnatural clarity from distant rooms, other times dying on the speaker's lips. This inconsistency bred caution. The children grew quiet not only from discipline, but from an instinctive understanding that the building responded to noise in ways they could not control. Even prayers were murmured more softly than required, their words pressed inward, as though sound itself were something to be rationed. Daily routines intensified as the orphanage aged. Repentance, once a guiding principle, became an obsession articulated through increasingly elaborate rituals of correction. Children were made to recount their sins, real or imagined, in slow, deliberate recitations that could last hours. Hunger sharpened attention, cold encouraged stillness, and fatigue blurred the edges of thought, until memory itself became unreliable. In this weakened state, suggestions took root easily. A forgotten misstep might be recalled as deliberate disobedience. A childish grievance could be reframed as evidence of innate corruption. The caretakers recorded these confessions diligently, their ink dark and unwavering, their language calm, even as the accusations grew more abstract. The surrounding community noticed subtle changes in the children who were occasionally allowed to attend church services under supervision. Their posture was rigid, their gazes fixed downward, their movements synchronized to an unsettling degree. They spoke rarely, and when they did, their voices carried a flattened tone that stripped words of urgency or warmth. Congregants remarked upon the way the children reacted to the sound of the church bell, flinching almost imperceptibly, as though bracing for something that never arrived. Attempts at kindness were met with confusion rather than gratitude, as if generosity itself were an unfamiliar concept requiring careful evaluation. These entries are frustratingly vague, noting only that certain corrective measures were more effective when administered after sunset, when distractions were fewer and the children's minds more receptive. No details are provided regarding the nature of these measures, only assurances that they were carried out with solemnity and purpose. Yet other documents hint at prolonged wakefulness, at enforced stillness maintained for hours in unlit rooms, at prayers repeated until their meaning dissolved into rhythm alone. The caretakers wrote of improved compliance following these sessions, of a deepened sense of humility that bordered on resignation. It was during these years that disappearances began to trouble even the most deferential observers. Children who had been seen at morning prayers failed to appear at supper, their absence explained as illness or reassignment. In some cases, their beds remained neatly made, showing no signs of use, as though they had not slept there at all. When questioned, the caretakers responded with mild irritation, reminding inquirers that the children's histories were often confused, that names were reused, that records could be misread by those unfamiliar with their structure. The explanations were plausible enough to discourage further inquiry, yet they did nothing to dispel the unease that settled like dust over the village. The land itself seemed to participate in this growing discomfort. The stream at the base of the hill, once a reliable source of water, developed a persistent film that resisted boiling. Livestock refused to graze too near the orphanage boundary, pulling against their tethers with visible distress. Trees closest to the building shed their leaves earlier each autumn, their branches bare and rattling long before frost claimed the rest of the forest. At night, fog gathered thickly around the hill, obscuring the lower walls of the orphanage, so that it appeared to float above the ground, untethered and watchful. Within the orphanage, the children's dreams grew heavy and indistinct. They spoke, when pressed, of long corridors that bent inward, of bells that rang without sound, of standing in rows while unseen figures counted them again and again, never satisfied with the number. Some described a sensation of being observed from within the walls themselves, of feeling breath where no one stood, of waking with the certainty that something had leaned close to listen. These accounts were dismissed as products of overactive imaginations or moral weakness, yet their similarity unsettled even those tasked with suppressing them. One winter night, a caretaker noted in the margin of a ledger that the lament had grown louder. This brief, almost careless observation stands out amid otherwise restrained prose. No explanation accompanies it, no attempt to clarify what was meant, yet subsequent entries reveal a heightened focus on silence. Children were punished for unnecessary movement, for restless shifting during prayers, for the smallest vocalization beyond what was prescribed. The building seemed to demand quiet, and the caretakers, whether consciously or not, complied. By the time spring returned, bringing with it the smell of wet earth and thawing wood, the orphanage had become something more than an institution. It had become a system closed upon itself, sustained by routine, secrecy, and the gradual erosion of individual identity. The children moved through their days with a practiced emptiness, their thoughts narrowed to the immediate demands of survival. Whatever the orphanage was shaping within them, it was not merely obedience. It was something deeper, something that required the steady stripping away of memory and self, leaving behind a silence that could be molded into any form required. And still, beneath the hymns and ledgers and carefully measured prayers, the lament persisted, threading itself through the nights like a low tide that never fully receded. It was not yet loud enough to demand action, not yet clear enough to be named. But it was learning, just as the building learned, just as the hill remembered. And what it learned from those early years would not remain contained forever. By 1747, the orphanage no longer felt newly built, though less than a decade had passed since its construction. The timbers had darkened unevenly, absorbing moisture and smoke until their surfaces bore a greasy sheen that resisted scrubbing. Floors creaked in places where no weight was applied, emitting soft complaints that traveled along the corridors like reluctant warnings. Even the air seemed older, thickened by years of breath, wax, and unwashed fabric, carrying a faint metallic tang that settled at the back of the throat and lingered long after one stepped outside. Visitors remarked upon the sensation of leaving something behind when they departed, a pressure behind the eyes, a dull ache in the chest that did not fully ease until they reached the river road. It was during this period that the orphanage's internal records began to show subtle irregularities. Dates repeated themselves without explanation. Names appeared twice in the same month, sometimes with different ages listed, sometimes with identical details copied word for word. In a few instances, entire weeks were condensed into a single paragraph, their activities summarized with vague assurances of order and progress. These inconsistencies were not dramatic enough to provoke alarm, yet they suggested a growing detachment from precise chronology, as though time within the orphanage had begun to compress, its days folding inward upon one another until distinctions lost their meaning. The children, too, seemed to drift outside ordinary measures of growth. Some remained physically small despite advancing years, their limbs thin and light, their movements careful and economical. Others aged rapidly, their faces acquiring a hollowed seriousness that made them appear far older than their recorded birthdays would suggest. Teeth loosened and fell out without replacement. Hair thinned prematurely. Illnesses lingered, neither worsening nor resolving, suspended in a state of quiet persistence. The caretakers attributed these anomalies to moral weakness or hereditary defect, explanations that required no further investigation and absolved the institution of responsibility. At night, the orphanage became a place of heightened awareness. Even those children who slept deeply during the day found themselves waking without clear cause, their eyes adjusting slowly to the dimness as they listened for something they could not define. The building settled around them with exaggerated slowness. Each creak stretched thin, each sigh of cooling wood prolonged until it resembled breath. From somewhere deep within the structure came the faint suggestion of movement, not footsteps exactly, but a steady shifting, like weight being redistributed again and again. No source was ever identified, yet the sensation of being counted persisted, an invisible tally conducted beyond sight. Caretakers began reporting disturbances among themselves, though these were recorded only obliquely, couched in language that emphasized fatigue and spiritual trial. Several complained of difficulty sleeping, of waking with the impression that prayers had been spoken aloud without their conscious participation. Others described moments of disorientation while moving through familiar halls, turning corners only to find themselves in rooms they did not expect, their sense of direction briefly but profoundly disrupted. These episodes were dismissed as the natural consequence of overwork, yet they increased in frequency, spreading among the staff with unsettling consistency. The surrounding villagers noticed that the orphanage bell rang more often than before. Its tone remained unchanged, but its timing grew erratic, sometimes sounding hours earlier than scheduled, sometimes not at all. On several occasions it rang continuously for extended periods, its dull clangor echoing across the fields until it became indistinguishable from the wind. When questioned, the caretakers insisted no such irregularities had occurred, suggesting instead that distance and weather distorted perception. Yet even those accustomed to rural life found this explanation unsatisfying, sensing that the bell's behavior reflected something amiss within the walls it served. One particularly cold evening, a child was found standing alone in the covered walkway leading to the bell tower, his bare feet reddened by the chill, his gaze fixed upward. He did not respond when addressed, nor did he resist being led back inside. Later, when questioned, he could recall neither how he had arrived there nor why he had remained. He spoke instead of listening, of feeling that something had been waiting for him to notice it. The caretakers recorded the incident as an episode of sleepwalking, though the child bore no signs of recent sleep, his eyes clear and unblinking. As spring approached, the lament changed. Those who heard it described a subtle shift in tone, a deepening that suggested not volume but density, as though the sound had acquired weight. It pressed against the ear rather than passing through it, leaving behind a sense of fullness that made silence feel incomplete. The sound no longer faded entirely with dawn, lingering faintly into the morning hours, detectable only in moments of stillness. Attempts to locate its source remained fruitless, yet its presence was acknowledged more openly, discussed in hushed tones that betrayed a growing inability to ignore it. Within the orphanage, discipline intensified further. The nocturnal sessions grew longer, their frequency increased, their purpose articulated with greater urgency. Children were instructed to listen carefully during prayers, to attend not only to words, but to the spaces between them. Silence was elevated from a practical necessity to a moral imperative, its observance framed as an act of humility and devotion. Those who struggled to comply were subjected to prolonged isolation, placed in narrow rooms where light and sound were carefully controlled, leaving them with little to focus on beyond their own thoughts. It was during one such period of isolation that a child scratched a series of marks into the wooden wall of his confinement. The marks did not form words or symbols recognizable to those who later examined them. They were irregular, looping, sometimes overlapping, as though drawn by a hand uncertain of its purpose. When asked what they represented, the child could offer no explanation, only a vague sense that they were necessary, that leaving the wall unmarked would have been wrong. The caretakers removed the markings, yet similar scratches appeared elsewhere in the building soon after, their origins never conclusively determined. By the end of the decade, the Virginia Repentance Orphanage had become a place where observation itself felt intrusive, as though watching too closely risked drawing attention in return. The children's presence had thinned, not in number but in substance, their individuality worn down to a series of responses and reflexes shaped by routine. The caretakers, once confident in their authority, now moved with a subtle caution, their actions guided as much by instinct as by instruction. And beneath it all, the lament continued its patient work, threading itself deeper into the fabric of the building, learning the contours of every room, every breath, every unspoken fear. When the first undeniable act occurred, the kind that could not be smoothed over by careful language or dismissed as coincidence, it would find a place already prepared to receive it. The orphanage had been listening for years, and whatever it had learned from that listening was nearing the point where it could no longer remain contained. The summer of 1751 arrived with a heat that settled heavily over the hill, pressing down upon the orphanage until its interior felt perpetually airless. Windows were opened whenever permitted, yet the breeze rarely reached beyond the sills, leaving rooms steeped in the odor of perspiration, old wood, and the faint sourness of damp linens dried too slowly. Flies gathered in corners and along the edges of ceilings, their persistent buzzing forming a low, irregular drone that blended uneasily with the building's natural creaks. Even the children's breathing seemed louder in the heat, each inhalation measured, each exhalation restrained, as though excess air were a luxury they could not afford. It was during this oppressive season that the first death was officially recorded. The entry is brief, noting only the child's name, age, and a presumed cause of illness described in terms so general they bordered on meaningless. No mention is made of circumstances, no acknowledgement of suffering. The body was buried in a small plot at the edge of the property, the grave unmarked except by a simple wooden stake that weathered quickly and soon became indistinguishable from the surrounding soil. The caretakers conducted prayers with their customary solemnity, yet those present later recalled an unsettling efficiency to the proceedings, as though the ritual were a formality rather than an expression of loss. In the weeks that followed, more children fell ill. Their symptoms varied, defying easy classification. Some grew lethargic, their movements slowing until even the act of standing required visible effort. Others became restless, unable to remain still, their eyes darting constantly as though tracking something just beyond their field of vision. Fevers came and went without pattern, accompanied by chills that persisted even in the height of summer. The caretakers responded with increased isolation, confining the sick to upper rooms where the air was thickest and the light dimmest, believing that separation would prevent the spread of whatever ailment had taken hold. The lament, once confined to the night, began to intrude upon the day. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for wind moving through distant trees or the low murmur of voices carried from the village below. Yet those who heard it felt an immediate tightening in the chest, a sensation of being addressed without being spoken to. The sound seemed to originate from within the walls themselves, vibrating through timber and stone alike, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. Children paused in their tasks, their hands stilling, their expressions momentarily vacant, before resuming as though nothing had occurred. Caretakers found themselves increasingly preoccupied with the building's condition. Cracks appeared in walls where none had been before, their edges darkened by moisture that seeped in regardless of weather. Doors swelled and warped, refusing to close properly or sticking stubbornly in their frames. The bell rope frayed at an alarming rate, its fibers snapping one by one until it was replaced entirely. Each of these issues was addressed individually, yet their cumulative effects suggested a structure under strain, responding to pressures that extended beyond ordinary wear. One evening, a caretaker failed to appear for supper. A search of the building yielded no trace of him, his room undisturbed, his belongings neatly arranged as they had been that morning. The caretaker's ledger records his absence with a single line, attributing it to a sudden departure prompted by personal matters. No further explanation is offered, and no attempt appears to have been made to verify his destination. The remaining staff accepted this account with an eagerness that bordered on relief, as though acknowledging uncertainty might invite something worse. Among the children, a quiet awareness began to spread. They spoke little of it, yet their behavior shifted in small, telling ways. Some avoided certain corridors altogether, altering their routes even when it meant risking punishment for tardiness. Others lingered near windows, drawn to the limited view of the outside world with a longing that seemed almost painful. At night, muffled sobbing could be heard from various rooms, though no one ever admitted to crying when questioned. The sound, like the lament itself, resisted ownership, existing without an identifiable source. The grounds surrounding the orphanage took on a neglected appearance. Weeds overtook paths once kept clear, their roots breaking through compacted earth and lifting stones out of alignment. The small burial plot expanded, its boundaries marked only by disturbed soil and the occasional fragment of weathered wood. Those tasked with maintenance found the work increasingly difficult, their tools dulling quickly, their efforts undone with surprising speed. It was as though the land resisted intervention, reclaiming itself with quiet persistence. As autumn approached, the illnesses subsided as abruptly as they had begun, leaving behind a residue of weakness that clung to the children long after their fevers broke. Several never fully recovered, their bodies remaining fragile, their expressions distant. The caretakers interpreted this as evidence of spiritual failing, redoubling their emphasis on repentance and humility. Prayers grew longer, fasting more frequent, silence more strictly enforced. The orphanage closed in upon itself, its routines tightening like a noose drawn slowly, deliberately. By the time the leaves began to fall, the lament had become an accepted presence, acknowledged without being named. It was no longer questioned, only endured, its persistence woven into the fabric of daily life. Those who lived and worked within the orphanage learned to move around it, to anticipate its ebb and flow, to recognize the moments when it seemed closest. In doing so, they surrendered something intangible, a willingness to resist or inquire, replacing it with a careful attentiveness that served not their own safety, but the demands of the place itself. The first death had passed without upheaval, absorbed into the orphanage's rhythm with unsettling ease. It would not be the last. And as the hills settled into another winter, its soil heavy with secrets, it became increasingly clear that whatever the orphanage had become, it was no longer merely housing the children entrusted to it. It was shaping them, claiming them, and preparing for a reckoning that would not be confined to ink and ledgers. The winter that followed was remembered not for its severity, but for its stillness. Snow fell rarely, and when it did, it melted into the soil without ceremony, leaving the ground dark and exposed. The cold arrived instead as a steady presence, seeping slowly into the orphanage until it settled in the walls and floors, a quiet inhabitant that could not be driven out by fire alone. Frost traced delicate patterns along the inside of windows, their shapes lingering even after the sun rose, as though reluctant to release their hold. Breath hung visibly in the air during morning prayers, each exhalation briefly forming a pale cloud before dissolving into nothing. It was during this season that the children began to wake at the same hour each night. No bell marked the moment, no sound announced it, yet across the building eyes opened almost in unison, their owners lying still beneath thin blankets, listening. Some later claimed they felt a pressure just before waking, a sensation like a hand resting lightly on the chest, not heavy enough to cause pain, but firm enough to demand attention. Others described a sudden clarity, a sharp awareness that cut through sleep as though it had been waiting patiently for the proper moment. Whatever the cause, the effect was consistent, and the nights grew increasingly tense as the children learned to anticipate that shared awakening. In those quiet hours, the orphanage revealed subtleties that daylight concealed. The wood contracted with soft, deliberate sounds, each pop and creak distinct enough to be counted. The distant rush of the river seemed louder, its rhythm slower, as though time itself had been stretched thin. Occasionally, a faint vibration passed through the floorboards, subtle enough to be dismissed as imagination, yet persistent enough to unsettle those who felt it. The lament, present but restrained, hovered just at the edge of perception, its absence as notable as its sound. Caretakers, too, were affected by this nocturnal convergence. Several reported waking abruptly without understanding why, their minds already alert, their bodies tense. Some rose from their beds and walked the corridors, lanterns casting unsteady light that revealed familiar spaces rendered strange by shadow. They found doors ajar that had been closed, candles burned lower than expected, chairs slightly displaced from their usual positions. No intruders were ever found, and the children, when questioned, professed ignorance with a sincerity that was difficult to challenge. The orphanage's records from this period show an increase in annotations written in a different hand, their script tighter, more angular, as though the writer's grip had hardened. These marginal notes comment on compliance, on silence, on the importance of maintaining vigilance. One entry refers obliquely to the necessity of listening more carefully, though it does not specify to what. Another warns against unnecessary speech during the night hours, citing disturbances that could not be easily corrected once begun. The tone of these additions suggests a growing anxiety, a sense that something essential was at risk of being overlooked. Among the children, small acts of defiance began to surface, though they were subtle enough to escape immediate notice. A child might delay rising when the bell rang, or miscount during recitation, or allow their gaze to wander during prayer. These infractions were met with swift correction, yet they continued, spreading quietly from one child to another. It was not rebellion in the conventional sense, but a testing of boundaries, an instinctive probing for weaknesses in a system that had come to feel increasingly oppressive. The caretakers responded by tightening controls further, unaware that each additional restriction only heightened the underlying tension. One night, the synchronized waking was interrupted by a sound that did not belong. It was brief, sharp, and unmistakably human. A single cry cut short almost as soon as it began. Lanterns were lit, corridors searched, Rooms inspected. No source was found. No child missing. No sign of struggle. The incident was recorded as a night terror, its significance minimized. Yet those who heard it felt a lingering unease that did not fade with dawn. The cry had carried an urgency absent from the lament, a rawness that suggested something unplanned, something that had broken through the orphanage's carefully maintained order. In the days that followed, one child stopped speaking altogether. He responded to questions with blank stares, his mouth opening as though to form words that never came. He continued his duties without complaint, his movements precise, his expression unreadable. When pressed, he would tilt his head slightly, listening, his attention fixed on something beyond the reach of those around him. The caretakers documented his silence as stubbornness, prescribing extended isolation and prayer. The treatment had no effect. The child remained mute, his presence a quiet disruption that unsettled both staff and peers. The building itself seemed to react to these developments. Doors slammed without provocation, their hinges shrieking in protest. Drafts moved through sealed rooms, extinguishing candles and chilling exposed skin. The bell rope snapped again, though it had been replaced only weeks earlier, its fibers worn thin as if by excessive use. Repairs were made, explanations offered, yet each incident added to a growing sense that the orphanage was straining against its own constraints, its carefully regulated existence beginning to fray. As winter wore on, the synchronized waking ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The nights grew uneven once more, some passing without incident, others marked by restless movement and shallow sleep. The lament receded, becoming faint enough to be questioned, yet its absence felt provisional, as though it had withdrawn rather than vanished. Those who listened closely sensed a tension beneath the quiet, a coiled patience that made the silence itself feel temporary. By the time the first signs of spring appeared, the orphanage stood at an uneasy threshold. The routines remained intact, the records meticulously kept, the outward appearance of order preserved. Yet beneath that surface, fractures had formed, small but significant, running through the lives of those confined within its walls. Something had shifted during that long, still winter, something that could not be undone by warmer air or longer days. The orphanage had learned that it could disrupt without revealing itself, and in doing so, it had taken another step toward a purpose that no ledger could adequately record. Spring came late to the hill, and when it did, it arrived without the relief the villagers had hoped for. The trees leafed out unevenly, some branches remaining bare long after others had filled with pale green growth. Wild flowers bloomed sparsely, their colors muted, their petals curling inward, as though protecting themselves from an unseen threat. The air carried the smell of wet soil and decaying leaves left over from the winter, a heavy, sweet odor that clung to clothing and hair. Even on warm days, the orphanage retained a chill, its stone foundations slow to release the cold they had absorbed. It was in this unsettled season that the second recorded death occurred, followed closely by a third. The entries in the ledger grew increasingly terse, listing names and dates without commentary, the cause of death abbreviated to a single word that appeared repeatedly: wasting. No further elaboration was provided, and no attempt was made to connect the cases, despite the similarities in their progression. The children grew thin, their appetites fading, their energy draining away, until they seemed to exist in a state of perpetual exhaustion. Yet, medical attention, such as it was, produced no improvement, and prayers offered no visible comfort. The caretakers responded by restructuring daily life. Labor hours were extended, under the belief that physical exertion would strengthen both body and spirit. Meals were reduced further, framed as acts of discipline meant to curb excess and encourage humility. Silence was enforced with renewed vigor, its observance monitored and recorded. The children complied, though their compliance had acquired a different quality. It was no longer merely learned behavior, but something closer to surrender, a relinquishing of resistance that left them hollowed and compliant in ways that were difficult to articulate. At night, the lament returned with a subtle insistence. It was no longer a distant sound, but one that seemed to permeate the building, vibrating through walls and floors until it could be felt beneath the skin. Those who lay awake described a sensation of resonance, as though their own breathing had begun to synchronize with the sound, rising and falling in reluctant harmony. Attempts to block it out proved futile. Covering one's ears did nothing to diminish it, and focusing on prayer only seemed to draw it closer, its rhythm weaving itself through the familiar cadences of devotion. Caretakers found their authority increasingly undermined by a growing sense of uncertainty. Instructions that had once been followed without question now required repetition. Their enforcement met with a blank acquiescence that lacked true engagement. Some staff members began to avoid the children altogether, limiting their interactions to what was strictly necessary. Others grew harsher, their corrections sharper, their punishments more severe, as though trying to assert control through force of will alone. The division created an uneven atmosphere in which fear and indifference coexisted, each feeding the other. One afternoon, a group of children was discovered standing motionless in the yard, their faces turned toward the orphanage, their expressions unreadable. They did not respond when addressed, nor did they disperse until physically guided back inside. When questioned later, they could recall nothing of the incident, only a vague impression of waiting. The caretakers attributed the behavior to fatigue and hunger, yet the image lingered in the minds of those who witnessed it, a silent tableau that suggested a deeper, more pervasive influence at work. The building's interior continued to change in small, unsettling ways. Stains appeared on walls where moisture had never been an issue before, their shapes irregular and faintly organic. The smell of dampness intensified, mingling with the ever-present odor of wax and old cloth. In certain rooms, the temperature dropped noticeably, even on the warmest days, creating pockets of cold that resisted explanation. Children assigned to these spaces complained of numbness in their fingers and toes, their complaints dismissed as exaggeration. The third death prompted a brief visit from a colonial official, whose inspection focused primarily on records rather than conditions. He noted the neatness of the ledgers, the apparent order of daily routines, and the absence of overt disorder. His presence was brief, his questions few, and his departure unremarkable. The orphanage emerged from the scrutiny unchanged, its outward legitimacy reinforced by the very thoroughness of its documentation. Whatever was happening within its walls remained effectively invisible to those unwilling or unable to look beyond ink and protocol. As summer approached once more, the children's numbers continued to fluctuate without clear explanation. New arrivals appeared to replace those who had died or vanished, their faces unfamiliar, their histories vague. They were absorbed into the existing routines with minimal disruption, their presence reinforcing the illusion of continuity. Yet among the older children, a quiet awareness persisted, an understanding that replacement did not equate to resolution. The building remembered those who had gone, and in some way that could not be defined, it seemed to miss them. The lament grew more insistent, its rhythm tightening, its tone deepening. It no longer felt passive or mournful, but purposeful, as though it were counting down to something that required patience and accumulation. Those who listened too closely reported headaches, dizziness, and a sense of pressure behind the eyes that did not ease with rest. Sleep became fragmented, dreams crowded with indistinct figures and endless corridors that led nowhere. Waking offered little relief, the boundary between night and day blurring until time itself felt unreliable. By the end of the season, the Virginia Repentance Orphanage stood as a place suspended between endurance and collapse. Its routines persisted, its authority maintained, yet its foundation had been subtly undermined by forces that could not be addressed through discipline alone. The children, diminished and altered, moved through their days with a quiet resignation that bordered on erasure. The caretakers, divided and strained, clung to procedure as a bulwark against doubt. And beneath it all, the lament continued its slow, deliberate work, drawing closer to a moment when its presence would no longer be confined to sound alone. The summer of 1753 settled over the hill with an unbroken heat that seemed to press downward rather than radiate outward. Days passed beneath a sun dulled by haze, its light filtering through the orphanage windows in a muted amber that flattened shadows and softened edges. The air inside the building grew thick and unmoving, carrying the combined odors of sweat, old paper, and damp stone. Even the insects that had plagued earlier summers appeared subdued, their movements sluggish, their presence reduced to the occasional drift of wings against glass. The stillness was so complete that it began to feel deliberate, as though the environment itself were holding its breath. During this time, the children's labor was expanded to include tasks that had previously been avoided. Cellars long used only for storage were cleared and reorganized, their contents cataloged and relocated. These spaces were cool and dark even at midday, their earthen floors uneven beneath bare feet. The children assigned to this work returned with dirt embedded beneath their nails and a faint, clinging smell that soap did little to remove. They spoke less than usual afterward, their eyes unfocused, their movements hesitant, as though some part of them had remained behind in the shadows below. It was in one of these lower rooms that a discovery was made, though it would not be formally acknowledged until much later. Behind a stack of warped crates, a section of wall had been concealed by rough planking, its boards mismatched and hastily nailed. When removed, they revealed a narrow recess extending deeper than the surrounding foundation should have allowed. The space was empty, its surfaces smooth and worn, bearing marks that suggested repeated contact over many years. The air within was noticeably colder, carrying a stale, mineral scent that made breathing uncomfortable. The caretakers ordered the recess sealed again immediately, offering no explanation and recording the incident only as a structural irregularity addressed. Following this discovery, the lament changed once more. It grew intermittent, breaking into shorter phrases separated by long stretches of silence. Each return felt sharper, more defined, as though the sound were being refined through repetition. Children reported feeling it closer to their bodies now, no longer diffused through walls and floors but localized, brushing against skin and bone. Some described a sensation of vibration in their teeth, others a tightening in the throat that made swallowing difficult. These complaints were dismissed as nerves, yet their frequency suggested a shared experience that could not be easily ignored. Caretakers began to exhibit signs of strain that extended beyond fatigue. Tempers flared unpredictably. Minor infractions met with disproportionate severity. At other times, discipline was neglected entirely. Instructions given without follow-through, punishments delayed or forgotten. This inconsistency created an atmosphere of uncertainty that unsettled the children more deeply than strict order ever had. They learned to move cautiously, to observe rather than act, to wait for cues that no longer followed a reliable pattern. In this environment, attention itself became a survival skill. One evening, during a rare thunderstorm that broke the oppressive heat, the orphanage was struck by lightning. The bolt hit the bell tower, splintering wood and sending fragments raining down onto the walkway below. The bell itself rang once, a distorted, uneven note that lingered unnaturally before fading into the roar of rain. Damage was minimal, quickly repaired, yet the incident left a lasting impression. Those who heard the altered ring described a sense of wrongness that persisted long after the storm passed, as though the sound had resonated with something already present, amplifying it rather than dispelling it. In the days that followed, several children complained of ringing in their ears, a high, persistent tone that made concentration difficult. Others experienced sudden bouts of nausea or dizziness, their symptoms appearing without warning and subsiding just as abruptly. No pattern could be established, no cause identified. The caretakers responded by increasing prayer sessions, their voices rising and falling in weary unison, their words echoing through corridors that seemed to absorb them without response. The building remained unmoved, its silence heavy and unyielding. The burial plot expanded again that summer, though not all additions were accompanied by ledger entries. Graves appeared that were not officially recorded, their soil disturbed and hastily smoothed over. Those responsible for maintenance avoided the area whenever possible, completing their tasks quickly and without comment. The ground there felt different underfoot, softer in some places, unnaturally compacted in others. Grass struggled to take hold, leaving patches of bare earth that resisted seeding despite repeated attempts. As autumn approached, the children's behavior grew increasingly uniform. Individual habits faded, replaced by synchronized movements that mirrored one another without conscious coordination. They rose, worked, and prayed with an efficiency that left little room for deviation. Their faces took on a similar expression, a subdued attentiveness that made them difficult to distinguish at a glance. New arrivals were absorbed quickly, their initial confusion giving way to the same flattened affect within weeks. The orphanage had begun to produce not merely obedience, but replication. The lament, now quieter than ever, did not fade. Instead, it seemed to retreat inward, its presence implied rather than audible. Those sensitive to it described a sensation of compression, as though sound had been folded into silence, stored rather than released. This absence was more unsettling than any noise, creating an expectation that hovered constantly at the edge of awareness. The building felt charged, its stillness taut, waiting for a moment when restraint would no longer be required. By the time the first leaves fell, brittle and pale, the Virginia Repentance Orphanage stood altered in ways that defied easy description. Its walls remained upright, its routines intact, yet something essential had shifted. The children were no longer merely contained. They had been shaped into something that fit the building too well, their presence reinforcing its purpose rather than challenging it. The caretakers, worn and divided, continued their duties with a growing sense of inevitability, and beneath the quiet, beneath the discipline and prayer, the orphanage held fast to what it had learned, preparing for a phase that would demand not just silence, but offering. The final winter arrived without announcement, as though it had always been present and merely stepped closer. Snow gathered early that year, clinging to the hill in dense, uneven sheets that muffled sound and erased familiar boundaries. The orphanage appeared smaller beneath it, its dark timbers pressed inward by the pale weight, its windows dulled until they reflected nothing at all. Smoke rose from the chimneys in thin, uncertain lines that bent quickly and vanished, offering no reassurance of warmth within. Those who passed along the river road spoke later of an instinctive urge to hurry, to lower their eyes and move on without looking back. Inside, the children grew quieter than silence itself. Their movements softened, footsteps barely disturbing the packed floors. Breath was taken shallowly, as though air were rationed. The lament was no longer heard, yet it was everywhere, implied in the pauses between sounds, in the way stillness pressed against the ears until it became uncomfortable. What had once been external had withdrawn completely, folding itself into the building and those within it. Listening was no longer required. Whatever had been waiting had learned enough. The caretakers ceased recording deaths altogether. Names simply stopped appearing. Numbers remained steady in the ledgers, corrected and recalculated with meticulous care. Yet those who performed the counts found themselves repeating the task again and again, unable to reconcile what they saw with what they expected. Faces blurred together. Ages became approximate. The children stood where they were told, answered when addressed, yet there was an absence behind their compliance that unsettled even the most resolute among the staff. It was not defiance nor despair. It was vacancy. One night during the deepest cold, the bell rang. It rang once only, without rope or hand, its sound low and distorted, thicker than it should have been. It did not carry far. It did not echo. It simply existed for a moment and then withdrew, leaving behind a pressure that made breathing feel intrusive. Those awake at the time did not investigate. Those asleep did not wake. In the morning, frost coated the bell tower so heavily that the structure appeared sealed in white, its entrance blocked by ice that resisted chipping until well after noon. After that night, the children began to disappear openly. They were present at morning prayers and gone by supper, their places unfilled, their absence unremarked. No searches were conducted, no explanations offered. The remaining children did not react. They adjusted their spacing automatically, closing ranks with an efficiency that suggested long practice. Beds were removed and stored away. Clothing was redistributed. The orphanage continued to function with fewer bodies and no disruption to routine, as though reduction were not loss but refinement. Caretakers left as well. Some departed openly, citing illness or obligation, their belongings gathered with haste and relief. Others simply failed to wake. Their rooms were found empty, their beds undisturbed, their personal effects left behind with an intimacy that suggested sudden departure rather than planning. No replacements arrived. Duties were absorbed by those who remained, their responsibilities expanding without complaint until even that structure began to thin. By the time spring attempted to return, the orphanage no longer produced sound. No hymns drifted down the hill. No bell marked the hours. Smoke ceased to rise from the chimneys, though the building remained intact, its doors closed, its windows dark. Travelers noted that the air around it felt heavier, cooler, resistant to movement. Birds avoided the trees nearby. The stream below the hill slowed unnaturally, its surface smooth and unbroken, reflecting the building with a clarity that made the image difficult to endure. When colonial officials finally returned, prompted by unanswered correspondence and the absence of reports, they found the orphanage standing empty. Beds were neatly made, tables set, ledgers carefully updated to the final day, their numbers balanced, their handwriting precise. No bodies were found. No signs of struggle or decay marked the rooms. The burial plot showed no recent disturbance, its soil compact and level, as though nothing had been added or removed in years. The recess in the cellar wall remained sealed, its planks untouched, its presence unmentioned in any surviving document. The officials departed quickly, offering no public explanation. The orphanage was never reopened. No orders were issued for its demolition. It was simply abandoned, left to weather and time, its existence gradually omitted from maps and records alike. Locals avoided the hill, teaching their children to do the same without explanation. The land resisted cultivation. Structures raised nearby failed within years, their foundations cracking, their occupants plagued by unease they could not articulate. Long after the building collapsed inward under the weight of neglect, the hill remained bare. Grass refused to grow where the orphanage had stood. Snow lingered there longest. Sound behaved oddly, carried away too quickly or not at all. Those who paused at the edge of the clearing reported a sensation of being measured, not seen but accounted for, as though presence itself were being tallied against an unseen register. Nothing ever emerged from that place. Nothing ever needed to. Whatever the Virginia Repentance Orphanage was built to contain did not escape, because it had never been confined. It had been cultivated, and when its work was complete, it left behind only absence, ordered and precise, a silence so thorough that even memory learned to avoid it. The hill still listens,